I've always believed that saving money equals building wealth. But I don't believe that is true anymore. Because if it actually worked, we wouldn't still be stressing about money. My name is Becky. I'm 39 years old. I am a single mama. And a few years ago, I went through a devastating, life-altering event. Now, I'm not going to unpack every detail of that right now, maybe in a future video, but this video isn't about all that drama. It is about a mental shift, about that moment I started questioning something that we are all taught from a very young age. That being good with money means saving it. That if you just put money on a savings account and don't touch it, you're doing the right thing. That safety equals success. And when life destabilized me, I started looking at that belief a little different. Now, before we go any further, if you are here at the very beginning, and you are because this is my first video on this channel, I'd love for you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Not because I have some polished financial empire to show you, I promise I don't. But because this channel is going to be me unpacking this shift in real time as someone who refuses to keep running on inherited beliefs without questioning them. I am not a financial expert. I am just someone who got shaken wide awake by life and realized I had been operating on autopilot when it came to money. And that autopilot belief was very simple. Save and you'll be safe. Save and you'll build a future. Just save and you'll be fine. And that question is the beginning of this channel. If you really think about it for a second, the idea that saving is the smartest thing you can do with your money, it didn't just randomly appear in our generation. It was passed down from previous generations. And not in a wrong way, but in a way that actually made a lot of sense at the time. Because when you go back to our grandparents and great-grandparents, they lived through periods that were genuinely unstable. War, rebuilding, scarcity, economies that were fragile and still trying to find their footing again. When you've lived through that kind of instability, putting money aside is not some abstract financial concept. It is security in its purest form. It is having peace of mind and a form of control in a world that just doesn't feel stable. And if you fast forward a bit to the 70s, 80s, even into the early 90s, something else was happening. Savings accounts were actually rewarding people. And I am not talking about the 1 or 2% of interest we're getting today that barely keeps up with anything. I am talking 5, 6, 7% of interest in certain years, of course. If you put money in the bank and left it there, it actually grew at a pace you could feel. It doubled over time. It did real work without you having to understand market or strategies or diversification. So when our parents told us just save money, they weren't being outdated or naive. They were repeating something that genuinely worked in their environment. They saw it work. They watched people buy homes, build stability, raise families on one income, while steadily putting money aside and seeing that savings grew in a meaningful way. And that is very powerful Because when something works consistently for a generation, it becomes more than advice. It becomes a value. It almost even becomes moral. You're praised for being careful, praised for not spending. You're told that risk is dangerous and caution is smart. And as a child, you don't question that advice. You absorb it. So by the time we are adults, saving doesn't feel practical. It feels right. It feels responsible. It feels mature. You look at your savings account, and even if the number isn't huge, there's this quiet sense of, okay, at least I'm doing that right. And I think that's where it gets interesting. Because when something feels both financially smart and morally good, you kind of stop questioning it. You don't stop to ask whether the environment that made it powerful still exists. You just continue the pattern. And I'm not saying that pattern is dumb. I'm saying that it was built in an economy where interest rates were high enough to make saving alone a growth strategy. It was built in a world where cost of living didn't outpace income at the same rate we're seeing now. It was built in a system that felt slower, more predictable, and less global. If you ask me, just less complex overall. So when we cling to saving as the ultimate strategy today, we're not being irrational. We're being loyal to what we were taught. And that's what made me pause and think for a minute. Because once you realize you are loyal to an inherited strategy, you start asking yourself whether you're choosing it consciously or are you just repeating it? So once I really allowed myself to see where this whole saving mindset came from and why it made so much sense historically, the next thing that I started to feel was this low-level irritation that kept coming back whenever I looked at my finances. Because even when you do what you're supposed to do, even when you try to be responsible, when you try not to overspend and be frugal so you can put something aside, there is this strange feeling that it doesn't really create momentum the way you think it should. And I remember sitting there looking at my savings account number and thinking, why does this feel more like maintenance instead of actual growth? And then you zoom out a bit and you look at what is happening around you. You look at housing prices compared to average salaries. You look at how much groceries cost compared to a few years ago. You look at the energy bills. Do we even want to go there? Insurance, healthcare, childcare, everything went up so fast. And meanwhile, your savings account is technically growing, but not in a way that changes your life. Not even at the same rate as the rising cost of life. And that's the part no one really wants to say out loud. Because saving still feels like the responsible thing, so you don't question it. You just assume you need to save more or cut more or be even more frugal. And at one point, I asked myself, if I was to save perfectly for the next 10 years, would my life actually look different? Or would I just have a slightly bigger cushion while everything around me keeps accelerating at a pace I can't keep up with? Because when you're 39 and you've already experienced instability and you're raising a child, You don't think in 6-month cycles anymore. You think in decades. And you ask yourself what the next 10 or 20 years is going to look like. You think about what your options are, how resilient you are, and about not being cornered by life. And saving alone, even though it's necessary, started feeling like protection and not the expansion that I want to achieve. It's like building thicker walls around you, but never actually increasing the space you live in. And that's where this sentence started forming in my head. And it's not meant as some catchy Instagram quote, but as something slightly confronting. Building savings doesn't equal building wealth. And I didn't even fully know what it meant yet when it first crossed my mind. I just knew that saving felt defensive. I felt like I was shielding myself from worst case scenarios. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all need that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had confused not losing with moving forward. Not losing is stability, but moving forward is growth. And when I looked at my own situation, honestly and realistically, I had to admit that most of what I had been focusing on was not losing. But I hadn't really asked myself what intentional growth actually looks like in this environment, in this economy today. And that's when my discomfort became curiosity. Because if saving is step 1, then what is step 2? And why is it so hard to find information about this in normal, understandable language? I noticed something interesting in the way I started looking at the world around me. Because instead of just asking myself, am I saving enough? I started asking a completely different question. And I mean that in a very, very practical way. When you look at people who over time have managed to create a real financial, stable life, real freedom, the kind where money isn't constantly a source of stress, what is it that they are doing that most of us don't? And if that's the advice that gets repeated over and over again, then there has to be another layer to the story. There has to be something else that happens after this first step. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had never been shown that second part in a way that made sense. Saving is explained everywhere. Schools talk about it. Parents talk about it. Banks talk about it. Even financial advice online starts with the same message. Save first. Yes, but what comes after that? At what point does the conversation move from protecting money to growing it? It's rarely just because they saved perfectly for 30 years. There's something else happening in the background. Something about the way their money moves, the way it is positioned, and how it works over time. And this is the part that almost feels hidden from everyday conversation. Maybe not intentionally, but just rarely explained in a normal and understandable way. You either hear very basic advice about saving, or you suddenly fall into very technical conversations about investments and markets that feel like a completely different language. And somewhere in between those two extremes is where I found myself standing. If saving is step 1, what are the behaviors that actually lead to wealth after that? What do people do with their money that allows it to grow instead of just sit? What kind of thinking creates that shift? And maybe even more importantly, how can someone like me someone rebuilding her life, someone raising a child on her own who has made mistakes and learned some pretty hard life lessons. How can I start understanding those behaviors and slowly bring those into my own life? Not just how to be careful with money, but how to eventually make it work for me. And the more that question kept sitting in my head, the more I started paying attention to the way that those people think about money in the first place. And I realized that the difference is often not just about how much money someone has, but about the way they approach the entire concept of money from the beginning. Because when you really look at it, most of us are raised to treat money as something fragile, something that needs to be protected, stretched, managed carefully, and saved whenever possible so that we don't end up in trouble later. That instinct makes sense when stability is the main goal. But the more I started observing people who actually build long-term wealth, the more I noticed that their relationship with money looks fundamentally very different. They still respect money, of course, but they don't spend most of their time trying to shrink their lives around it. Instead, they spend most of their time thinking about how to expand what money can actually do. And that difference in thinking shows up everywhere once you start paying attention to it. For example, while most people focus almost entirely on income, getting a salary, negotiating a raise, maybe working more hours or taking on extra work, people who build wealth tend to focus much more on assets, on things that exist beyond their own time and effort. In other words, they're constantly asking themselves what they can build, what they can acquire or position in a way that continues producing value over time, even when they are not actively working every single hour of the day. And that idea alone completely reframes the role that money plays in your life, because suddenly money isn't just something you earn and protect. It becomes something you direct, something you place or position, something you organize in ways that allow it to grow or create opportunities later on. Another thing that started standing out to me is how much they value control in their lives. And I don't mean that in a sense of being obsessed with every detail, but control over the structures that shape their future. Control over where their income comes from. Control over how their time is used. And control over decisions that affect their long-term trajectory. And when you start looking at wealth from that perspective, you realize that money is not just about consumption or comfort. It is about positioning. It is about creating enough stability and leverage that your life isn't constantly dictated by circumstances you can't influence. What fascinated me about all of this is that none of these ideas are actually secret. They're not hidden behind some mysterious financial wall. They're simply not part of the everyday conversation most people hear growing up. Most of us grow up hearing how to avoid mistakes with money. Much fewer people grow up hearing how wealth is intentionally built. And that gap between those two conversations is exactly what captured my attention. Because if saving is the first layer of financial responsibility, which I still believe it is, then the next layer has to be understanding how money can eventually move beyond simple protection and start creating momentum. And that for me is where this channel begins. not from the assumption that everyone watching is starting from the same place, and also not from the idea that there is one single formula that works for everyone, but from a genuine curiosity about how wealth is actually built in the real world that we are living in today, and how those patterns can be understood and applied in a way that is thoughtful, grounded, and realistic. So over time, we're going to explore those questions together. How wealthy people tend to think about money, what kinds of decisions shape long-term outcomes, how assets are built, how leverage works, and how someone who decides to think differently about money can slowly start repositioning their life in that direction. And if that conversation resonates with you, if you've ever had the feeling that the financial advice most of us grew up hearing might only be part of the story, then I think you'll enjoy being here as we unpack the bigger picture together. So if you want to follow along from the beginning, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell, because the whole point of this channel is to keep pulling on that thread and seeing where it leads. And in the next video, I actually want to make this very practical, because the next logical step is understanding what people actually do different in their financial lives. So we're going to break that down in a very concrete way. I'll walk you through 4 financial moves that start shifting someone from simply protecting money to actually building wealth over time. And I'll use real numbers so we can see what those choices look like in practice. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, and remember, building savings doesn't automatically mean building wealth. So if that's something you're curious about, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.